In today's video, we are learning how to create a simple web page from within R. It's nothing fancy, we'll just put in a page that has a headline, a bit of text and a button. What's up everyone? If you don't know me, my name is Albert Rapp, and in this video series I help R users to understand concepts from web development a little bit better. And in today's installment we're going to build a small website using the HTMLtools package in R. This will teach us a couple of common tags from HTML as well as a couple of CSS keywords, and that way we start to get more familiar with these two languages. So that's our playbook for today. Let's build a nice website. In my quarter file, I've already put in a code chunk that is hidden right now, where the completed code is living in, and this completed code saves this web page into a variable called finished web page. And if we call this variable, we can always have a look at the finished image. So this is our goal for today's lesson. Let's start out building this. The first thing that we'll need is a container for our block that we see in the viewer window. So let's get rid of our variable here and then put in a div container. We have seen with the web inspector in the last video that div blocks are really the fundamental building blocks for everything. So with a div, we can just throw in some text like this is a div. And if we execute this, we'll actually get the HTML code in the console and not inside of the viewer window. But we can change this by passing the div or whatever HTML we have. It also works with all kinds of other tags. If we pass this to the browsable function, then what we create will be visible in the viewer window. Okay, so this was already step one of figuring out how to build our finished web page. Let's have a look at it again to know what we need to insert. So let us always keep the browsable here. Let's put this on a new line. And now let us fill the div container with the things that we actually need in here. The first thing that we need is an h1 tag to get a level 1 headline in here. And with HTMLtools, just with a div function, if we need a div container, we have called the div function. If we need an h1 tag, we call the h1 function and fill it with something like this is a headline. And if we execute this, well, we will get a headline. Similarly, we can throw in a paragraph, then we'll get a paragraph. And then what we've seen in the image is that we want to get a button. Let's have a look at this again. Let's look at it. It has a button that says communicate insights now. And if I click on this, then I will get redirected to the web page of my data visualization course. This is a shameless plug right here. Go visit this website if you're interested in learning all kinds of stuff about data visualization. I actually want to redo the sales page here anyway. So this is how I came up with the idea of what I want to do for this HTML and CSS intro. But as I've said, we're not going to create something as complicated as this. We are focusing on a very small part, basically the stuff that is at the top here. It's the same content. We just want to build it with R. So back in RStudio, we have to figure out how we can get the button in there. And here's a fun fact for you. A button like the one that you see here is in a lot of cases actually not really something special. It's just a hyperlink to some web page. And in HTML, what you need for that is an A tag for getting a link in there. So you could fill that with this is a button. This will show you that, okay, this is nothing else than the text. But if you put in an href in there, a URL, which you can link to, then you will see that this truly becomes a hyperlink. And if I click on this, then I will get redirected to my web page. So really what we have to do here is to just use a bit of CSS to style the URL so that it looks like a button. That will be the trick here. And in case you're wondering, what does this href thing do? Well, if we execute only this part here, we can see the HTML code behind this, and you will see that this is an A tag. This part here is the opening of the A tag, the anchor tag. This one is the closing. What you see in the viewer window is the stuff between the opening and closing tag. And the href part was simply put inside the opening of the A tag. This is a fundamental thing that all tags in the HTMLtools package have in common. If you name something like we did here, then what we have put inside of that name, in this case it was this code here, it will simply be put inside the opening using the name that we have used inside of our R code. And this will help us to style all of these elements that we have in here, because we have learned last time that we can style any tag by putting a style argument, just like the href argument, inside of the opening tag. So really styling all of this code here is just a matter of doing the same thing here using the style keyword. We'll do that in a second, but for now, let us fill all of this stuff here with some meaningful content. So for the h1 tag, we can put in the headline that we've seen before, this insightful data visualization for uncreative R users. For the button, I want to have some call to action like communicate insights now. And for the paragraph, let us actually look at the finished web page to see what's going on there. There we want to use this part. And what we could do is just copy and paste this here and insert this in here. But notice that here ggplot2 and this without being a design expert is actually styled differently. So it helps to split up what goes into the paragraph onto separate lines here. So what we do here is we put in a quotation mark in there, put it in there as well, this part here too, and this one goes in there. And now we also need it for the without being a design expert. And if we put the commas in between there and align this nicely, then we can see that we have everything on a separate line now. Just make sure that you have nice code by putting everything on a new line. I like to indent my code this way. You don't have to adhere to this exact style. It's just what I like to do. Okay, and even though we have put things on separate lines, the code will actually ignore those separate lines. It will put everything inside the same paragraph. It is not like each line here gets one new paragraph. And the reason why this is happening is because, as I've said, all of these tag functions are styled the same. If you press F1 to open the help function, you can actually navigate into the correct one. And you see here that all of these tag functions, they start with the ... operator, which means that it just catches everything that we throw inside. And if we navigate down, we see in the arguments that named arguments become the tag attributes. This is what we have done here. We have named something and it became an attribute inside of the A tag. So attribute is nothing else than the fancy way of saying something that goes inside the opening tag. And the unnamed arguments, they become children, which means that they go really inside of the tag, by which I mean the stuff that is between the opening and the closing tag, which means that all of these things became children of the P tag. And if we look at this, the HTML code reflects that. Everything here is on a new line, but since this is an P tag, everything in the end looks like it is in one paragraph. But we did this in order to style things like ggplot2 and this without being a design expert separately. If you recall, in the finished web page, these things are the ones that are styled differently. But let's worry about this thing later. For now, let us start with styling the other tags like the H1 and the button tag. It's actually not a button tag, it is an A tag. I have to be careful here. I'm using the A tag like a button, but there is actually a thing that is a button tag. So I don't want to confuse you here. When I say button in this video, I mean the A tag. It's always the A tag in this video. So what we could do now, for example, with the H1 tag is to insert a bit of style in there. And we've just learned that if we name what we put inside of there, this will become an attribute, and the style attribute determines, well, the style. So we could put in some CSS code like color, colon, and then blue, and this will make the headline blue. You see, CSS is all about these key value pairs. Here we use the color key and set it to a value like blue. And if we wanted to use multiple keywords, we could just put them all in there one by one like this, put in font minus size and set this to, I don't know, like 38 pixels. In this case, the headline became larger. So it's really just a list of key value pairs separated by this semicolon here. But you can imagine if you want to throw in a lot of key value pairs, putting everything into a string like this becomes very annoying and tedious fast. So this is why the HTMLtools package has a way to avoid this. You see, what HTMLtools gives you is the CSS function. And in there you can just throw in named arguments. So we could put in color and set this to blue again. And now we have a blue headline, but we also wanted to have it larger. So let's set this to font underscore size and set this to, I don't know, it was 38 pixels, I believe. And now we have a larger headline again. Notice one thing. In the previous code, I have written font minus size because that is the CSS keyword for the font size. But in the CSS function, I have used font underscore size. The reason for that is since minus is an operator to do, minus calculations, if you put in a minus here, then you will actually get an error. If I execute this now, it will say unexpected equal sign because it thinks you have to subtract font minus size, and this is not something what you want to do here. So this is why in this case you can just use an underscore, and if you look at the output of the CSS function, you will see that it will translate it to the font minus size argument. This can sometimes be a cause for confusion, so this is why I'm telling you what's going on here. So now that we are on the same page on how we can put in style, keywords and values inside of our tags, let us just throw in a bit of key value pairs. And even if they are new for you right now, you probably won't have any trouble figuring out what's going on. For now, we are working on the really easy ones, something like color and font size. Oh, and by the way, as always, if you find this video useful, don't forget to hit that like button, because this will help me to feel good about myself so that I can keep on making more videos. So thank you for hitting the like button. And now let's get back to the video. So let's remove this part in here and then throw in something which looks nicer. Right now, this is how our web page looks without any styling. And let's throw in a couple of keywords in there. Let's put the font family to Libre Basketball. Just change the font family. And similarly, you can increase the font size, you can make things bold, and you can change the line height. And you've probably noticed that the font weight didn't change anything here, because it seems by default H1 tags are already bold. So if we put this to 300 to make it not bold, 600 is bold, 300 is regular, you see that the H1 tag became, well, not bold. But since I do want to have bold text, let me just throw in the 600 again. And that way we can be sure that we will always have bold text in there. The same thing can be done for the paragraph here. Here I don't want to use any tags that I haven't used before, so let's just go over this quickly. We set the style argument of the paragraph tag again, and in there we use the CSS function to generate the CSS code for making the font size to 26 pixels. This way the text became larger, and I want to make the line height a little bit larger so that everything moves down a little. And if I were to make my window smaller here, this argument would determine then how close the lines are to each other. So if I comment this out here, then things move closer together. I want to have a bit more space, so this is why I put that in there. And for our anchor tag, we can do the same thing. There I'm just going to throw in all of that at the same time. I set the font size, the font weight, and what I do is I set the text decoration to none. This way we get rid of the underline that anchor tags have by default. You see, before I put this in there, you could see an underline in there, but I don't want to have that. So this is why I've removed this part. All right, let's have a look at our finished image again to see what we can do next. Maybe we should start working on the button here. You see right now it is white text on this dark bluish background. And in CSS, we can do that using the background tag. This will give you a terrible look. So this is why we also put in the white color in there. And this way, we at least get the right colors, but it still looks ugly because there isn't any space between the text and the borders here. We'll fix that in a second, but for now, let us worry about the background of this whole page that we see here. You see in our finished image, we have this bluish background and we want to have the same thing in here. So let's put this in there. And we have just learned what the background does. So we could do the same thing for the div that contains all of these things. So we could just put in a style argument in there, and then we could style this thing just like we did before using the CSS function. We could set the font family as well. This changes only the font family for the button and the paragraph, because for the headline, we have already hard coded this. You see, that's the code for that. And this is why the headline didn't change, because this part here is more specific, because it goes directly into the tag that has the style later on. And here, this part here goes only in the surrounding tag. Similarly, we could put in a color. This way we don't have this strong black color, but something grayish, which looks always a bit nicer than pure black. And then we could set the background color, but this time I don't want to set this to some fixed color. Instead, I want to use the linear gradient function. That is something that CSS has baked into it. And there we could put in a linear gradient between these two colors here. And if we execute this, then we see that we get this bluish shade in here. And here I have used the linear gradient with two very similar colors. So this is why you probably have a bit of trouble seeing the gradient in the background. But usually I like to use very similar colors to make sure that this gradient is something subtle, which I feel like is always nicer than something that is very straight in your face kind of thing. So this is why these colors here were chosen, so that the background looks almost like it is the same color, but there is a little bit of fluctuation in there, which I think looks nice. In any case, with that, we are already pretty far on our way to our finished web page. Let's have a look at the finished image. The colors already look pretty good. What we have to work on is the spacing. You see in the button, there is more room for the actual button. in our current web page, the background for this anchor tag is really close to the text. So this is why it doesn't really look like a button. And also notice how the text here shifted to the borders of the container here, to the borders of the colored background. That's because there is no margin or padding in there. And if you compare this with the finished web page, it looks much nicer in the finished web page because there is some room between the text and the actual borders. So to make this happen for our current status, we have to put in a bit of padding inside of this div container that contains everything. In CSS, it's actually pretty confusing at first. There are two things that do similar things. There's padding and there's margin. And really the difference is that padding is basically the margin inside of the container and margin is the margin between containers. Okay, so if I would put in margin into the h1 container, this margin would determine how much space there is between the h1 tag and the p tag. We could try this out by putting in margin and in there putting in 10 pixels. And if we execute this, we can see that there is a bit more space between the h tag and the paragraph tag. Let's actually put in something like 50 pixels. And here you also see that if I set this to something large, then I do get quite a lot of margin also on top of the h1 tag, but really not in the sense of what I'm going for, because I want to have the margin, I want to have space between the container that has the background and this headline, and not the space between this tag and the container that is the web page. So this is why this is always a bit confusing. And this is also why I'm talking about this. So what you need to take away from this for now is that padding is the margin inside of a container and margin is the, well, margin between containers. There's also a little bit of difference in how margins and paddings behave, and we'll get to that in a second. But for now, let us first make sure that we work with the paddings on the parent container, on the div container, so that everything moves inside of this blue area. So for now, let's get rid of this part here. Everything is as it was before. And then we can put in padding into this container here. And there we could put in something like 50 pixels. This puts in a 50 pixels padding into this container. And this means that it should be a 50 pixel padding inside of that container on all sides. You can actually see that this is not what's happening here, because there is way more space on top of the h1 tag compared to the space that is below the anchor tag. We'll figure this out in a second, but for now I want to show you other ways of how to set the padding, because that part is important. An alternative way to set the padding is to use two numbers actually, so 20 pixels and 10 pixels. And if you execute this, you will see that you will get a 20 pixels padding on the top and the bottom. Again, this looks weird, like way much over here because there's something weird going on, but the point still is that the first number is the padding that you have on top and on the bottom, and the 10 pixels is the one that you have on the left and on the right. For example, if I put this to 50, then you see here that everything shifted so that there is a padding here, and there's also more space over here. And if you want to be even more specific, you could use 4 numbers instead of 2. This will give you the numbers for top, bottom, left, right. And I always forget which number is top, bottom, left, or right. I would have to look this up in my notes, but it doesn't matter. When I want to be really specific about this certain side, then I can always use padding bottom, for example, and set this to 50 pixels. And that way I have also put in the padding at the bottom of 50 pixels here. So now that we have that covered, let us actually put in some reasonable values in here. Let's put in 50 pixels and 30 pixels. But again, we see here that there is much more room at the top compared to at the bottom. And at first I had no clue what's going on here, because I was pretty sure that this command here did exactly what I wanted it to. But we have learned in the last tutorial of this series that we have a tool with which we can check what's going on. We just have to open up our web page in our browser, and then we can press inspect and go onto the h1 tag to see what's going on. And if you look at this h tag here by hovering over the h1 tag, you see with the orange lines that you see here that there is actually some margin around the h1 tag by default. You could actually see this in here in the CSS style pane. You see here that there is a margin of 0.6 EM. That's some unit. We don't have to go over this right now, but the point is there is some margin. So if we were to put in margin top and set this to 0 pixels, then we actually get an error because I use the R word for margin top. Remember, when you want to use these things inside of your browser, you actually have to use minus and not underscore. And now you see that you have actually modified the style as is right now. And now the space at the top and at the bottom looks very similar. And if you hover over the H1 tag, you won't see any margin on top anymore. So just like I've said in the last tutorial, the web inspector is a phenomenal tool with which you can try to debug what's going on, and you can even put in styles into specific elements to see if the stuff that you've changed will actually do what you want. Just make sure that you use the actual CSS keywords and not the RCSS keywords that I've used, but don't worry if that happens to you. As you can see, this happens to me all the time too. In any case, we can copy this part, go into R, and then put this in here. We just have to make sure to change the style so that it aligns with the R code. So now we have fixed the issues with the margins and the paddings. Alternatively, we could also set margin to 0 pixels. This will get rid of all margins, not only the top one, but also the one at the bottom. And then if we wanted to specify the spacing between the paragraph and the other containers, we can set the margins inside the style of the paragraph. Here I could choose a margin bottom of 20 pixels and a margin top of 15 pixels. So now that you have seen both margins and paddings, let me just mention that I completely understand that this is weird in the beginning. And the thing is also that they also behave differently in the sense of what happens if a margin is next to a padding. Do these things add up together or do they not add up together? And these things are complicated. It's a bit annoying in the beginning. So this is why I try to use only margins which auto collapse. They do not add up together, which is something you have to know. But once you know that, it's kind of okay to work with that. And I use paddings only in the case that I have seen here, namely when I want to move something further into a container. And in all other cases, I try to use margins. That's my rule of thumb of trying to deal with the madness of margins and paddings and they behaving differently depending on what's what. So my friendly advice is to try to use margins as much as you can and use paddings only in the specific case I've shown you here. Case in point, let us worry about making the A tag a bit larger so that the button actually looks like a button. And here we have to use the padding because we want the text to move further into the shaded background area. So let's put in a padding of 15 pixels and see what's going on. Nice, this worked and we now have a nicer button. At least the text is not so close to the border as we've had before. And this obviously makes for a better looking button. And another thing that you might have noticed here is the margin between what is the button and what is the paragraph changed, even though we have specifically put in margin bottom to 20 pixels. So you'd think that the space, even though we have put in paddings in here, stays the same because, you know, we have hard-coded margin bottom should be 20 pixels. But apparently this was ignored. So let's try to look into the web inspector to see what's going on there. We can inspect that, and with hovering over the paragraph, we see on the left-hand side that indeed the margin is intruded by the button. So right now in the orange area, we also have part of the blue button. And the reason for that is simple, but it can drive you mad if you've never seen this before. So I'm just going to tell you this. If you look into the A tag, you won't see any specific sites that might be the cause for this. But if you know A tags a little bit, you can think of them just like text, right? They are just hyperlinks. So you could just embed them into a text and they will go onto the same line as the text. So this means in the speak of HTML and CSS, this has a display of inline. If I put this to inline, actually nothing changes because by default, an A tag is treated like an inline element, just like an inline text. But if I wanted to make it adhere to the margins of other containers, I have to make sure that the A tag also behaves like a container, like a block. And this is why we can put in a block in here. And now if you look into the code, or if you hover over the P tag, you will see that now the margins are actually adhered to. But a super annoying thing about the display block is that, well, it is a block that by default spans the whole line. But we do not want to have a button that, well, spans the whole line. That's kind of ugly. So we kind of want to have the best of both worlds of the inline display and the block display. And thankfully there is such a thing as inline blocks, and this is the best of both worlds that we want. The margins are adhered to, but this element here doesn't fill up the whole line because it still has some inline style as well. Okay, so with that, we know that we have to put in display inline block, and then we can copy and paste this and put this into our A tag here. So let's throw this in there. And just like before, we have to make sure that we use the R compliant code. And now everything looks nice. Display is also one of those things that I found confusing in the beginning, and don't worry too much if this feels weird to you at first. Just know that there is this argument called display, which can help you arrange things differently and make elements behave differently according to the display. There's actually another really important display, but we will cover that in a separate tutorial so that we can focus on just the things about the display that we want to look at. Just as a spoiler, it will be display grid and display flexbox. They are great tools to arrange elements on a grid or some other way, but they require a bit of work. So this is why I only show you display inline block here. Okay, we are getting pretty close to our finished web page. Let's have a look at it to see what we are still missing. Notice how the edges of our button here and our container that has the whole bluish background, the edges are kind of rounded off. Right now, if we look at our code, the edges are, well, just like really 90-degree edges. And this is usually not as nice as these rounded off edges. So let's put in a CSS keyword for that, which is border radius. Let's set this to 8 pixels, and that way we can see that the edges were rounded off a little bit. And we can do the same thing for our button. Put this in there, make sure that everything aligns nicely. And now our button also looks a bit nicer. Let's look at our finished image again and notice that the button has some shadow behind us. This is always a fantastic thing to make things look nice, a little bit more three-dimensional. It is really just a bit of black blurred color at the edges of the original container, but it's surprising how effective this is in making things look nicer. So we should put this into our image as well. And this works via the box shadow argument. And if we execute this, you will see that you will get this shadow in there. And this requires a couple of arguments, so let's play around with them. Let's set this to 10 or like 15. So we've increased this and see what happens. Okay, so the first one shifts things to the right, so this is the X offset. Similarly, the second argument is the Y offset. So we've had this at 5 pixels before, so that the shadow is kind of close to the button. Similarly, the third number here, let's set this to 20 pixels, determines the amount of blur. See, I have increased the 10 pixels and everything became more blurry. If you put this to 0 pixels, then you will just get the color as is. And if you want to get a color, you actually have to specify the color. And here, this is just an RGB code. 000 is a black color, and it has an alpha channel, which means transparency. And we have set this to 0.6 here. So really, this here is just the color code for black transparent color. And if we increase the blur, then everything looks nicer. Okay, this is starting to look really good. I think we are almost done. We just have to check what we still need. Yep, as I thought, it's this part here, making this part bold and making this thing look a bit different. So what we have to do here is to go into our paragraph and modify each line separately. This is why we have put these things onto separate lines in the first place. So what we could do now is to take this part here and throw this into another tag that uses a bold styling. In HTML, there's actually such a thing as the B tag, which is code for bold. So we could just put this part here into this B tag. Let's try this. Let's have a look. We throw this in there. We kind of expect that this thing works because the same thing happened with all the other tags. So HTMLtools hopefully has a B tag or a function for the B tag as well. But if we execute this, we see that it's actually not working. And the reason for that is because this B tag is actually just a shortcut for the strong tag. And this one does exactly what we want. But I want to show you a different thing here because this B tag exists. So it should also exist in HTMLtools. And the thing is, it does, but it is a tag that is not used as often as you'd think. Instead, people like to use strong. So this is why HTMLtools didn't bother of creating a specific function for this that you can just call like this. So you need to look at all the tags. This is kind of like a list that HTMLtools gives you. And via the $sign, you can access this list. and in there you will find all tags that are available, and this includes the B tag. And that way you can use the B tag as well, and you have your bold text as a result. Finally, let's have a look at our finished web page. We have to worry about making this part blue. This is still inline text, but we want to have it styled differently. And in HTML, inline text uses a specific tag, which is called the span tag. And this is a very common tag, which is why the span tag function exists. So we can use this as is. And if we execute this, nothing changes. This is still the same whether I use span or not, because the span tag by default does nothing than just put things inline. But what we've had before was inline anyway. But what we can do now is to set the style of this inline tag. And in the style argument, we can do the same things that we've done before, which is using the CSS function and then using a couple of key value pairs like font weight, font size, font family, and color. And that way we have made ggplot2 into something that uses a monospace font, which is often the code font. And we have used a different color, and then we have changed things like font size and font weight. And to make this stand out a little bit more, we can also use a bit of padding to move things horizontally. And now if we compare this to our finished web page, we see that there is no difference at all, which means that we have successfully built this web page here. If you found this video useful, you may also enjoy the other videos from the Web Dev 4R series. Link to that is either here or in the description of this video. Or if you want to learn more about ggplot, you can check out this video. Or if you want to even take a course on data visualization to learn all kinds of cool tricks with ggplot, you can check out the link in the description, which leads you to the course for which we have just built a nice little web page. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.